Hi, Ebi. This is Mr. Mitch K. We're doing something a little different here. We are doing audio feedback on these essays. So what I'll be doing is reading through the essay and commenting as I go along. And then you'll have a chance to listen to those comments, and then we can sit down and take a look at what it is you heard from my comments, and also look at the rubric and where I felt like you met those standards and where there was room for improvement. And then if you want to, you could go ahead and revise as well. So here we go. East Williamsburg. In The Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jane Jacobs outlines the criteria that a city must meet in order to be successful. She cites clear demarcations between private and public space, eyes on the street, mixed usage, and diversity as a few aspects a city must have. But even in a city like New York, which meets these criteria and functions very successfully, individual neighborhoods cycle through transformations of bad and good. The way people in cities interact with their neighborhood or their street can depend upon their own personal experiences or beliefs. Additionally, in the case of gentrification taking place in Brooklyn currently, the transformation to good neighborhood might actually be considered undesirable by the residents who gentrified it. Last Saturday, and Saturday should be capitalized, my brother Rill and I were walking through the neighborhood between Williamsburg and Bushwick. This area, recently dubbed East Williamsburg, extends roughly between the Grand and Morgan stops on New York's L line. Williamsburg lies to the west, and Bushwick extends further east into Brooklyn. Many of the buildings in this region are warehouses which rise in uniform squarish rows and turn their blind walls to the street. There is a bit of graffiti on the bricks and a lot of broken glass on the sidewalk. To me, this did not feel like an unsafe neighborhood, but it did feel slightly forlorn. A few semi-trucks were parked diagonally against the street as men in work gloves unloaded cardboard boxes from their backs. A dark stain of water crept across the cement from a running hose. East Williamsburg, as it has been renamed, appears rather single-use and industrial. Yet this area is slowly beginning to be appropriated by residential and business ventures as the tide of gentrification washes further into Brooklyn, traveling metro stop by metro stop on the L train out of Williamsburg. That's a great paragraph, I have to say, and your descriptions are wonderful. It really paints a picture of this particular street and this neighborhood. My only concern even with that is you want to make sure that you're working towards that thesis statement, and this may be kind of background information as you kind of warm up for your argument, but it's important to make a connection between the observations you're making about this neighborhood and the overall argument. Mauger Street, where we walked, seems bleak in comparison to Knickerbocker Avenue, a major cultural center of Bushwick, the neighborhood where Rill lives. On Knickerbocker, there are many clothing stores, corner groceries, and beauty supplies. There are food trucks and women selling jewelry or perfumes from tables on the sidewalk. On weekend mornings, the sidewalks are crowded with families. The businesses on Knickerbocker are almost all owned and run by the large Latino community that comprised Bushwick before young white hip types, e.g. my brother, began to move in. This contrast between Bushwick and East Williamsburg is significant in a few ways. Firstly, the danger that businesses along Knickerbocker could be displaced by rising rents if the gentrification of Bushwick continues, which it almost certainly will. That's not a complete sentence there. Firstly, so you've ended up with a sentence fragment there, even though it's a well-constructed sentence fragment. This is not exactly an issue that Mauger Street faces, in the sense that there were very few displaceable small businesses established there to begin with. New residences, shops, and show spaces are able to move into this industrial area between Williamsburg and Bushwick with relative ease. And because the L line grants easy access to East Williamsburg, it has become a new area for Williamsburg-type expansion. As Rill described it, it's a great example of how access can drive change in the landscape of a city. The L train stops between Grand and maybe even Jefferson are, I guess, serving some workers. There's a huge boar's head factory that's been there forever. but weren't really serving a neighborhood. But because that vein of transportation was there, a neighborhood has clearly developed around it. That's a great quote from Rill. Sounds like he would be a good guest speaker for us, because he really does seem to have an understanding of the dynamics for his neighborhood and the ones around it, as well as for cities as a whole, and I'm glad you included his quotation. That afternoon, Rill and I were actually headed to one of those new businesses. A perfumer named CB had opened shop at 318 Modger Street the previous week. We reached the address and paused. 318 was a metal door set into the concrete wall. There was nothing to indicate what was inside. This was my first impression. Later in the day, there was a small sign placed on the sidewalk that read, "CB, I hate perfume." Looking closer, we noticed the buzzer was labeled CB in blue pen. We rang it a few times, and a bearded man in a black V-neck answered the door. He directed us to the third floor. The hallway smelled like new paint, and it was clear that the store was still busy moving into their new building. The store itself on the third floor was already furnished with a cashier's desk, a few chairs, and bottles of CB's work on 2 metal shelves. As we looked through the rows of perfume, Rill began to ask the man behind the counter about their move to East Williamsburg, out of Williamsburg proper. He responded that the previous location had received too much foot traffic, a lot of stroller moms, and waved his hand dismissively, explaining that those weren't the kind of customers they wanted. Which is so ironic, because of course that's a demographic that most businesses would kill for. And I love the idea that this person is escaping all that foot traffic because somehow that was undesirable. What struck me about this was that CB moved to avoid the very sidewalk traffic that Jane Jacobs advocates. In fact, the store had relocated to an area lacking any of the aspects that she describes as desirable and stable. His was not interested it looks like that sentence needs some cleaning up. His was not interested in the casual interaction and public space of city life. He had to know about CB already in order to find his shop. Jane Jacobs does not seem to have fully accounted for the way that neighborhood populations change over time, especially in New York, based on the personal preferences and ideals of their residents. This is especially true in the case of gentrification, which is often, at least for the hipster crowd, about finding the next new place, intentionally relocating to neighborhoods that are, quote-unquote, undesirable. I believe my brother phrased this phenomenon well, based on his own observations. A lot of people in Williamsburg, which is obviously the epicenter of this gentrification movement, feel like it got nicer as a neighborhood for a while, and that was good. But now it's this unstoppable force as more and more interest comes, and it's too nice. There are too many recognizable businesses. There is too much money. To me, pejorative use of the phrase stroller mom, which I have often heard used, encapsulates this attitude. That Williamsburg is now a place where people want to raise children makes it an unattractive prospect for those looking for an undiscovered neighborhood. Jane Jacobs describes heavy sidewalk use, mixed varieties of buildings and businesses, and effectively utilized public parks as key points of city and neighborhood health. By these criteria, Williamsburg is ideal. What Jacobs doesn't necessarily account for is the cultural implications of that stability, the emotions that accompany gentrification. This Brooklyn neighborhood has become a safe place for wealthy, mostly white young couples to start families. As Spike Lee said in February during a presentation at Pratt Institute, when you see white mothers pushing their babies in strollers 3 o'clock in the morning on 125th Street, that must tell you something. He went on to ask the audience, why does it take an influx of white New Yorkers in Harlem and Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights for the facilities to get better? Right now, there's a standard narrative of gentrification. A low-income, usually people of color-dominated neighborhood somehow becomes a point of convergence for a wealthier, usually white population. Over time, property values begin to rise as the neighborhood is discovered and the original owners and renters are driven out. Additionally, as Spike Lee drove at in his remarks, an increasing amount of white people in a neighborhood can lead to the city providing greater services. For example, more timely garbage pickup or better police protection. The politics of this kind of gentrification are deeply connected to systematic racism in our society. It can be hard to see, though, because each instance is different. I believe that gentrification is extremely complicated and contextual, but the basic cycle is familiar to everyone who lives in cities and affects the way we think about neighborhoods. While highly gentrified areas like Williamsburg may benefit the city as a whole, the personal experience and feelings that accompany its gentrification are negative. There are people who have been displaced and disrespected, and the residents of New York are aware of that. Responding to the backlash against Spike Lee's commentary, an article in the Huffington Post observed that gentrification doesn't need a PR team, because the likely majority of those who are troubled by it as a principle are actually gentrifiers in practice. This is the phenomenon Rill and I observed in the new development of East Williamsburg. I would argue that the wealthy white youngsters participating in Williamsburg culture tend also to be well-educated, liberal, and quite aware of the gentrification in their neighborhood, which puts them in an uncomfortable position. So that sentence, which puts them in an uncomfortable position, isn't a sentence by itself. You could add it to the end of the previous sentence. So instead of after neighborhood a period, you'd have a comma, which puts them in an uncomfortable situation. It seems likely that many people living in Williamsburg are anti-gentrification in theory, but when they try to escape down the L line further and further into Brooklyn, they bring their privilege along with them. That's a great observation and kind of the crux of the matter here. The East Williamsburg Industrial District has been easier for new businesses to take over than Bushwick has, because it is a bit of a cultural vacuum. It's interesting that residences, shops, and show space are relocating from Williamsburg to this area, but not exactly surprising. Williamsburg's gentrification has become almost legendary, and ironically, that makes the region less attractive to the type of people who gentrified it in the first place. I believe New York is a functional city and a prime example of Jane Jacobs' theories. However, the way neighborhoods develop has much to do with the residents' backgrounds, views, and societal privileges. That's very nicely said. Residents, by the way, the apostrophe should come after the S rather than before it. Well, that is a really interesting read, I have to say. You've done a great job taking these kind of more broad, generalized theories and translating them into practice and what they look like on the ground in a particular neighborhood, and a particularly interesting neighborhood. This is a really insightful set of observations about a tricky and complicated issue like gentrification. I love that you had Rill's words in there, that you based it in on-the-ground observations and descriptions that really brought things to life. It actually reminds me quite a bit of Jacobs herself. I think the writing is as descriptive and as engaging as Jacobs' writing is, doing much the same thing, which is to step away from theory and look at practice. And that was exactly the point she was making, was that you can theorize all you want about certain concepts, but what you really have to do is observe how those concepts play themselves out in an actual neighborhood in real time. So this is very, very successful in that regard. I think there's room for it to be a little bit more focused in terms of a thesis that you follow through more clearly, that you weave through with topic sentences and all of that. There are ways in which you could sharpen its focus and make it even more effective. But the heart and bones of this piece are very, very strong indeed. And it's really a pleasure to read, and something I could imagine us sharing with other students in the future. Great job, and I look forward to talking with you about it.